In the winter of 1944, a group of German engineers stood around a wrecked American Sherman tank like surgeons preparing for an autopsy. The tank was burned, its paint blistered, one track blown off. It had been dragged from a battlefield in France to a secret test ground in Germany. For months, German tank crews had complained. The armor feels too thin. The gun is nothing special. So why do they keep coming? Now the engineers had their chance to find out. They sharpened cutting torches, marked lines on the hull, and prepared to slice the tank open. They expected to find some hidden alloy, some new trick in the armor, a secret that explained why this inferior machine kept winning battles by simply being there again and again and again. They tore it open and discover. The story didn't start in that quiet test ground. It started months earlier in the chaos of Normandy. Lieutenant Erich Bauer commanded a Panther tank. He was proud of it. Long barrel, sloped armor, a machine that looked every bit the big cat its name promised. On a June morning, the air still smelled of smoke and salt from the invasion days before. His tank crouched behind a hedgerow, half hidden by leaves and earth. Through his turret periscope, Erich saw them. Shermans, 3 of them moving down a French lane between hedges. They looked wrong to him. Too tall, too thin, awkward, like someone had taken a box, put tracks under it, and called it a tank. Amy's, his gunner, muttered, "Easy prey." Erich wasn't so sure. He'd seen what happened when German units underestimated these boxes. Still, the Panther was in the perfect position. Target left. First Sherman, he ordered. The gun swung. The gunner exhaled. Feuer. The shot slammed into the lead Sherman. The American tank erupted in flame, smoke pouring from the turret. The second Sherman jerked to a halt, then began reversing, fumbling for cover. The third tried to ram through the hedgerow, scraping and grinding. Erich adjusted. Next one. Hurry. Another shot. Another Sherman stopped moving. The third disappeared into a narrow side lane. Erich watched it go. "One," he said. "Only one left." By the end of that day, he'd lost count. Every time they knocked out 2, 3 more appeared. Every time the smoke cleared, somewhere on the horizon, a fresh group of Shermans was already coming. That night, as he sat on the hull of his battered Panther, Erich said something quietly to his crew. "This war," he muttered, "is going to be decided by whoever can build more of those ugly boxes." He was closer to the truth than he knew. Hundreds of kilometers away in a complex of brick buildings far from the front, Ober-engineer Hans Meyer ran his hand along the side of the captured Sherman. He didn't care what it looked like in battle. He cared how it was built. Hans had spent his life in factories. Before the war, he'd worked in civilian industry, cars, machine tools, anything with gears and bearings. He had one obsession. He hated waste. Not just wasted material, wasted movements, wasted time, wasted complexity. War had dragged him into a different kind of factory, one that built machines for killing. He didn't like that. But he believed in his craft. He believed that if the state was going to pour precious steel into tanks and guns, it should at least do so efficiently. The problem was, Germany had never really learned how to do that with tanks. They built them like complicated watches, beautiful, precise, fragile. Hans had seen the Panther production lines. He looked at the plans for the Tiger. Too many parts, too many machining steps, too many things that had to be just right or they wouldn't fit at all. And now he stood in front of an American machine that looked like someone had designed it with a hammer. He stared at the Sherman. Then he smiled faintly. "Let's see why it refuses to go away." The Sherman sat on steel blocks in the middle of a test hall. Its track sagged. Its turret was jammed at an awkward angle. Around it, lamps hung from rafters, casting hard white light. Hans gathered his team, younger engineers, welders, a few soldiers on temporary assignment. Today, he said, we find out what is inside the American workhorse. One of the younger men, a draftsman named Kurt, snorted. I can tell you already, he said. Soft steel, poor welding, a tractor engine. Hans glanced at him. You think so? He asked mildly. Kurt shrugged. Everyone says so, he replied. Hans nodded. Yes, he said. They do. He picked up a piece of chalk and drew a line along the side of the Sherman's hull. But I prefer not to believe everyone. I prefer to look. The torches hissed to life. Sparks showered the floor as they cut into the tank's skin. The smell of burned paint and hot steel filled the air. When they pried back the first section of armor, Kurt leaned in. The edge of the plate was rougher than he expected. Not elegant, not carefully machined. Cast, he said. Hans nodded. Yes, large castings, not rolled plate like many of ours. Kurt frowned. Is that good? Hans smiled slightly. That depends, he said. Do you want perfection or quantity? He tapped the casting. Big pieces, fewer welds, less machining. He looked at Kurt. That means more tanks per day. He moved his hand along the inner edge. And the armor? Kurt asked. Hans shrugged. It is not magic, he said. Moderately thick, reasonable slope in places, enough to stop some shells, not enough to stop others. He straightened. If the secret were armor, he added, our problems would be much simpler. They removed more sections, revealing the interior, seats, racks, radio mounts. Hans climbed inside. It was cramped. No tank was spacious, but he noticed something at once. He could reach things, not with acrobatics, not by wriggling through a maze. Levers were where hands wanted to go. Hatches opened cleanly. The driver's position had a simple, almost civilian logic. This feels like a truck, Hans murmured. A truck you can fight in. Kurt squeezed in behind him. It's ugly, he said. Yes, Hans replied. It is ugly in exactly the right way. He pointed. See the gearbox? Simple, robust, not finely tuned to a narrow performance band. He tapped a cable. Controls routed to avoid sharp bends, easy to adjust, easy to replace. He turned in place, studying the turret ring. Look at the access to the ring gear, he said. We hide ours under layers of complication. They treat it like something that must be serviced by tired men with cold hands. Kurt traced a weld. The finish work is sloppy, he said. Hans smiled. Finish work does not kill Panzerfausts, he replied. Finish work does not tow your broken machine off a frozen road. He ran his hand over a casting. They save precision for where it matters. He tapped his forehead. That is the secret of good engineering. Kurt's eyes narrowed. You mean mass engineering? He said. Hans's smile faded. Yes, he said quietly, and we have always preferred to engineer for pride. They moved to the engine compartment. The rear plate came off in a shower of sparks. Behind it, the heart of the Sherman waited. Depending on the variant, a Sherman might carry different engines, radio aircraft engines, multi-bank monsters, later diesels. This one held an R975 radio. Kurt stared. It really is an aircraft engine, he said, surprised. Do they have so many they can simply put them in tanks? Hans examined the mountings. Perhaps, he said. He pointed at the way the engine sat on its cradle. But note this. Standardized interfaces bolted in where it can be removed as a unit. He gestured to the floor. See the access panels? A team with a crane could lift this whole mass out in hours. Kurt frowned. Can we not do the same? Hans thought of the Panther's engine bay, of the tightly packed components, the parts that had to be moved before anything else could be reached. You can, he said, if you build for maintenance instead of glory. He looked back at the radio. It is not elegant, he said. It wastes fuel. It is loud. It is heavy. He smiled faintly. but it works again and again on roads, off roads, in the hands of men who learn to maintain it in a few weeks, not a few years. Kurt touched a hose clamp. They use the same fastener here as in the front, he said. Hans nodded. Yes, he said. Did you notice that? Kurt blinked. I thought it was coincidence. Hans shook his head. It is religion, he said. Their religion of standardization. He pointed to the walls of the workshop around them. On German factory walls, tools multiplied like vines, different sizes, different shapes, each one perfect for one task. On the Sherman, the same wrenches could serve half the machine. That, Hans said, is how you build 10,000 tanks and keep them moving. As the days passed, Hans's team catalogued every part they could. They sketched brackets, measured plate thickness, weighed components. One evening, as the hall emptied, Hans stayed behind. He crawled through the Sherman's interior one last time, checking racks and shelves. A small compartment caught his eye. He pried it open. Inside was a packet of papers sealed in a plastic bag. He slid it out and wiped off the dust. American English stared back at him. A manual. He carried it to a bench and sat down. The cover showed a Sherman silhouette and words he couldn't read. He called for Friedrich, a colleague who'd spent time in the United States before the war. Friedrich arrived, adjusted his glasses, and began to translate. It is a maintenance guide, he said, written for field crews. He flipped pages, step-by-step instructions, illustrations, troubleshooting charts. Hans leaned closer. The manual was not written like a technical paper. It spoke directly to the reader. When you hear this noise, Friedrich read aloud, it probably means this. Check here first. If that doesn't solve it, try this next. Kurt, listening nearby, snorted. Do they think their crews are children? Hans didn't answer immediately. He took the manual, studied a diagram. No, he said softly. They think their crews are important. He turned a page. They think a man trained to fight is too valuable to waste on guessing why his machine won't start. He tapped the paper. So they talk to him like a partner. Friedrich found another section. Here, he said, it shows how to adjust the tension of the tracks with minimal tools. He looked at Hans. This is not high art, he said. Hans nodded. This is not written for engineers, he said. It is written for farmers and mechanics and boys who learned to drive a tractor last year. He set the manual down carefully. Their secret, he said, is not hiding in the armor. It is hiding in sentences like these. The day came when Hans had to present his findings. A group of officers sat at a long table. Some wore tank badges. Others had staff insignia. Blueprints of German designs hung on the walls. On an easel stood a rough diagram of the Sherman's interior. Hans felt every pair of eyes weighing him. He began simply. The Sherman's armor, he said, is adequate, not remarkable, sloped in many places, strong enough against some guns, not against others. An officer frowned. We know this, he said. Then why does it matter how it is built? Hans met his gaze. Because the armor, he said, is not why the tank keeps coming back. He moved to the next chart. The engine is powerful enough, he said. It is not especially efficient. It is not especially advanced, but it is mounted in a way that makes replacement simple. He showed diagrams of the engine cradle, the access panels. They can swap engines in the field faster than we can get a Panther into a workshop. A staff officer with narrow eyes leaned forward. And the gun, he asked. Hans mulled. Their standard 75, he said, is inferior to ours in penetration. He let that sit. But they mounted in a turret that rotates quickly with optics that are good enough and with space for the loader to work without gymnastics. He paused. They did not chase perfection, he said. They chased sufficiency and repeatability. A panzer colonel snorted. You are praising them, he said. Hans shook his head. I am describing them, he replied. What you hear as praise is merely our failure to do the same." The room stiffened. Hans took a breath. "The true secret of this tank," he said, "is that it was never designed to be the best tank." He looked each man in the eye. It was designed to be built by the thousands, maintained by ordinary men, and replaced faster than you can plan a counterattack. He tapped the drawing. "It is a cog," he said, "in a machine that begins in their factories and ends where our fuel and ammunition run out." After the meeting, 2 officers stayed behind. One of them, a general with tired eyes, approached Hans as he rolled up his sketches. "You have done good work," the general said. Hans shrugged. "I have done work," he replied. The general looked at the Sherman, its insides exposed. "Can we copy any of this?" he asked. Hans thought for a long moment. "We can copy the shape of the parts," he said. "We can copy some assembly methods." He shook his head. "But we cannot copy what makes it truly dangerous." The general frowned. "And what is that?" Hans gestured vaguely. "The ability to treat a tank not as a precious jewel," he said, "but as a consumable tool." He looked back at the gutted Sherman. They built a tank that an economy like theirs could afford to lose 10,000 times. He lowered his voice. "And they built an economy that can afford to lose them." The general's face tightened. "And we Hans smiled without humor. We built masterpieces," he said, "then sent them into a war where masterpieces died just as easily as anything else." The general sighed. He seemed older suddenly. "Continue your work," he said quietly, "even if it is only to tell history why we lost. Numbers don't win battles alone, but they tell stories." In the months that followed, Hans kept receiving reports from the front. One day, a letter from a tank officer like Erich Bauer. Hans did not know him personally, but he knew his type. The letter was attached to a damage report. "Engaged enemy Shermans," it read, "destroyed 4, knocked out 2. Had to withdraw when we ran low on fuel and ammunition, and the next wave arrived." Hans traced his finger along the lines. He imagined the scene. A few Panthers in good positions, a few kills, maybe more. And then above the sound of guns, the distant rumble of more engines, not better tanks, not invincible tanks, just more. He opened another file. This one showed American production statistics. He didn't know if the numbers were exact. He only knew they were terrifying. He wrote a note in the margin. A tank like the Sherman, he scribbled, needed not be superior to any one of ours. He underlined the next words. It need only be good enough to do its job and be followed by another, and another, and another. Months later, as the war bled into 1945, Hans found himself standing beside another burned-out Panther, this time far closer to the front. The unit had sent for him to assess whether the wreck was worth recovering. The air smelled of wet earth and cordite. A truck arrived with a familiar face in the back. Lieutenant Erich Bauer. He jumped down, limping slightly. "You're the engineer?" Erich asked. Hans nodded. "I am," he said. "Meyer." Erich looked at the Panther and shook his head. "Beautiful machine," he said, "until it stops." Hans smiled sadly. "I've heard that before." Erich gestured toward the horizon out there, he said. "They keep sending Shermans." He looked at Hans. "Is it true what they say?" Hans shrugged. "What do they say that you opened one to it? Looked for its secrets?" Hans nodded. "I did." Erich's eyes were tired. So he asked, "Is it some special steel, a new kind of armor?" Hans thought of the manual. "The standardized boats. The engine cradle?" "No," he said. "The armor is ordinary. The gun is adequate. The engine is loud and thirsty." He met Erich's gaze. "The secret," he said, "is that it was built for the world you're actually fighting in, not for the world our designers wished existed." Eric frowned. "What does that mean?" Hans gestured vaguely. "It means," he said, "it was built for mud, for poor fuel, for drivers who learned last month, for mechanics who will not have the right tool." He pointed to the Panther. "This was built," he said, "for the ideal crew on the ideal day with the ideal infrastructure." He looked back at the imaginary horizon where Shermans never stopped appearing. Their tank, he said, was built to survive everything else. Eric was silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "Then we never really had a chance," he said quietly. Hans hesitated. "In the duel," he said. "One Panther against one Sherman." He smiled thinly. "We had every chance." He looked at the wrecked Panther. "But the war was never just a duel. The war ended. Germany burned. Cities were reduced to twisted steel and stone." Hans found himself walking through a captured German factory years later, this time as a visitor in a country trying to rebuild. The ruins had been cleared, new machines installed. On one wall hung a poster showing a production line for tractors. The tractors looked suspiciously like disarmed tanks. An American advisor stood beside him. "We learned a lot from your people," the advisor said, "about armor angles, about high-velocity guns." Hans laughed softly. "And we," he said, "learned a lot from yours." The advisor smiled. "Yes," he said. "I've heard you examined our Sherman." Hans nodded. "I did." The American looked curious. "What did you think?" he asked. Hans thought back to the first time he'd climbed inside, to the crude welds that worked, to the manuals that talked to soldiers like partners, to the engine mounted for replacement, not admiration. "I thought," Hans said slowly, "that it was the first tank I'd ever seen that understood it was going to war with human beings, not with idealized drawings." The advisor chuckled. "We didn't have the luxury of ideal drawings," he said. "We just needed something we could build, fix, and ship." Hans looked at him. "And that," he said, "was the real weapon." Years later, when historians argued about tanks and guns and who had the best machine, they often brought up the Sherman. Some mocked it, some defended it. They talked about armor thickness and gun caliber, about duels with Panthers and Tigers. They wrote pages on steel and ballistics. Few of them ever visited the inside of a factory. Few ever spoke to men like Hans, who had watched the Sherman's guts spill onto a workshop floor. If they had, they might have realized. The Sherman's real secret was never that it could outfight every opponent. It was that it could be everywhere long after Germany's perfect tanks had broken down. It was a machine that turned American industry into something that could cross oceans, crash through Hedgeros, and still find a mechanic who knew how to fix it with a single wrench and a stained manual. When German engineers tore open a Sherman, they didn't find mysterious armor or magic guns. They found something far more terrifying. A design philosophy that treated tanks not as symbols, but as tools. Tools that could be built by the thousands, operated by ordinary men, and sacrificed if needed without collapsing the entire system. In the end, that was the secret they could not copy. Not because they were less intelligent, but because their entire nation had been built on a different promise that genius and courage could compensate for everything. The Sherman was proof that sometimes quantity, simplicity, and respect for the limitations of real human beings were more powerful than any perfect masterpiece. And somewhere in a dusty file, in a forgotten archive, a German engineer's report lies unread, explaining in precise, measured language what he already knew the first day he looked inside. The Sherman was not invincible. It was worse than that. It was repeatable.